Welcome to the video. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Grab a seat and enjoy because this one's going to be exciting. The fire crackled in the clearing, casting long shadows over the snow-blanketed ground. The woods around them were still, the trees heavy with ice, their branches like skeletal fingers stretching into the December sky. 4 friends sat close to the flames, the cold gnawing at their backs despite their layers of fleece and down. It had been Jeremy's idea to camp in the woods just outside Eldridge Hollow, a spot known more for ghost stories than scenic views. He always had a taste for the macabre, and tonight, with the world gripped by winter, seemed perfect for a scare. "So, who's got the first story?" Jeremy said, his grin illuminated by the firelight. His breath fogged in the freezing air as he looked around the circle. Claire rolled her eyes and pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. "How about the one where we don't freeze to death in the middle of nowhere because someone couldn't pick a better weekend?" "Come on," Jeremy replied. "This is prime campfire material. The snow makes it better. Creepy things always happen in the snow." "Creepy things happen when you make us sleep in sub-zero temperatures," Claire shot back. "Stop whining." Mark, sitting cross-legged next to Claire, poked at the fire with a stick. "Let's get on with it. We didn't come out here to listen to Claire complain." Yeah. She huffed and looked away. "I've got one," said Lisa, Jeremy's girlfriend. She leaned forward, her voice low and conspiratorial. "It's about this very spot. My grandfather used to tell me about these woods. Said they were cursed. There was a logging camp here back in the 1800s. The workers started disappearing one by one, but there were no tracks in the snow, no signs of a struggle. Just gone. Eventually, the rest of them abandoned the place, but some say the ones who vanished are still out here wandering. They never left." "Wandering? That's weak," Mark scoffed. "What are they, ghosts? Zombies?" "Neither," Lisa said. "They're worse. They're still alive, but different, changed. They walk through the woods looking for someone to take their place so they can leave." "That's ridiculous," Claire said. "But fine, I'll admit. It's a little creepy." "Wait till you see one," Lisa replied, a teasing grin spreading across her face. The fire hissed, a log splitting down the middle, sending sparks into the air. The sound made them all jump, though none of them would admit it. The conversation turned to lighter topics, the tension dissipating as the night deepened. One by one, they retreated to their tents, zipping themselves away from the cold, the fire burning low in the center of their camp. Jeremy woke first. Something had disturbed him, though he couldn't say what. The cold inside the tent was sharper now, like it had crept in while he slept. He lay still, listening. The woods were silent, save for the occasional creak of branches under the weight of snow. But there was something else, soft, deliberate crunching in the snow. "Footsteps. Mark," he whispered. No answer. He unzipped the tent slowly, poking his head into the icy night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. The woods beyond were impenetrably dark. And then he saw them. Tracks in the snow, faint but unmistakable, leading away from the camp. They were human, or close enough. Bare feet, their outline disturbingly clear in the moonlight. The prints circled the camp, looping around each tent. Jeremy's breath caught in his throat. He scanned the woods, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. "Mark, Lisa, Claire," he called out, louder this time. The sound of his own voice unnerved him, fragile against the cold. The others stirred, unzipping their tents and emerging into the clearing, their faces groggy and irritated. "What the hell, man?" Mark grumbled. "It's freezing." "Look," Jeremy said, pointing at the tracks. They followed his gaze, their expressions shifting from annoyance to unease. "Whose are those?" Lisa asked, her voice small. "They're not mine," Jeremy said. "I woke up and saw them." Mark frowned, rubbing his arms against the cold. "Maybe someone's messing with us." "Who?" Claire snapped. "We're miles from anything. Nobody even knows we're here." "Then what made them?" Lisa asked, stepping closer to one of the loops. She crouched, running her gloved hand over the outline. "These aren't boots. They're barefoot." "Bullshit," Mark said, though his voice wavered. "Nobody's out here barefoot in this weather." "Tell that to whoever made these," Lisa replied. The tracks led into the woods, disappearing into the dark. The group followed them cautiously to the edge of the clearing, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. The prints were precise, their depth and spacing unchanged, as if whatever had made them moved with mechanical precision. But then they stopped, abruptly and without explanation. The last print was perfectly defined, as though the creature had stepped into the snow and vanished into thin air. "See?" Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something." "Raccoons don't vanish into thin air," Claire snapped. They returned to the fire, but the unease lingered, clinging to them like the cold. Jeremy stoked the flames back to life, the flickering light chasing away some of the darkness, but none of the fear. They sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts, their eyes flicking toward the woods. When dawn finally came, it brought no relief. The tracks were still there, circling the camp in perfect, mocking loops. They checked the woods again in the weak morning light, but the snow was undisturbed beyond the last print. No sign of where the intruder had come from, or gone. They packed up quickly, the chill in the air sharper than before. Jeremy kept glancing over his shoulder as they hiked back toward the road, half expecting to see a figure watching from the trees. The tracks haunted him, etched into his mind as clearly as they were in the snow. When they finally reached the road, the sight of the car brought a surge of relief. They loaded their gear in silence, the crunch of their boots on the snow the only sound. As they drove away, the woods seemed to close in behind them, swallowing the clearing and its strange visitor. It wasn't until later, as they sat in a diner miles from the forest, that Jeremy noticed the footprints again. This time they were faint and wet, smudged into the snow clinging to the car's floorboards. He stared at them, his stomach knotting, as the same looping pattern stared back at him. The tracks had followed them. The wind in the pines always had a voice. That's what my granddad used to say. He grew up in Eldridge Hollow, a little town nobody's heard of, sandwiched between mountains and thick, endless forests. I never paid much attention to his stories when I was a kid. They seemed like the kind of spooky yarns old men spin after too much bourbon. But when I found myself camped in the middle of those same woods with 3 friends, I couldn't get his words out of my head. It was Jeremy's idea to go. He always had a knack for finding places with a story, places steeped in the kind of local legends you'd expect to find in a paperback horror novel with a torn cover. The Whispering Pines, he said, had history, old murders, strange disappearances, the kind of folklore that made the hair on your arms stand up when the fire burned low and shadows grew long. "Don't you want to see if the stories are true?" he asked me with a grin that didn't quite meet his eyes. I didn't, but I said yes, anyway. We arrived on a bitter December afternoon. Snow covered the ground in patches, and the air was sharp enough to cut. The pines rose tall and black against the sky, their branches tangled and heavy with frost. The clearing we chose felt too open, like the woods were leaning in around us, watching. But Jeremy insisted it was perfect. "This is the heart of it," he said, spreading his arms wide as if he were welcoming something home. Claire hated the cold, and she made no secret of it. She spent most of the day wrapped in a plaid blanket, muttering about frozen toes and frostbite. Eric, her boyfriend, did his best to keep her spirits up, but even his charm wasn't working. Jeremy, on the other hand, was in his element, bustling around with a can of beer in one hand and a flashlight in the other. When the sun set, the cold deepened. The fire struggled against the darkness, its flames licking weakly at the air. We sat around it, huddled close, our laughter growing softer with every passing minute. The trees loomed beyond the firelight, black and impenetrable. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind. A faint sigh threading through the branches, soft and distant. But it wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Words, half-formed and broken, floated just out of reach, carried on the icy gusts. I glanced at Jeremy, who sat grinning like a maniac, as if he could feel it too. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Eric looked up from the fire. "Hear what?" Jeremy leaned forward, his grin fading into something sharper. "The pines," he said. "They're talking." Claire rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Jeremy. You can't seriously believe that crap." "Why not?" Jeremy shot back. "You think every story comes out of nowhere? They whisper to people, always have. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." I stared into the woods, straining to hear. The sound came again, stronger this time. It wasn't just whispers. It was voices, layered and fragmented, overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. Some were soft, pleading, while others were harsh and accusing. I could pick out phrases here and there. "Help me." "You promised. Why did you leave?" "Stop it," Claire snapped, her voice brittle. "You're just trying to scare us." But Jeremy wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at the trees, his face pale and serious. "It's real," he said softly. "You feel it, don't you?" "I feel like we should leave," Eric said, standing up and brushing snow from his jacket. "This isn't funny anymore." The fire sputtered, throwing sparks into the air. The voices grew louder, closer, like a tide rising around us. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy with something that didn't belong. Claire stood, her blanket falling to the ground, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "I don't like this," she whispered. "I don't like this at all." Jeremy's eyes glittered in the firelight. "It's them," he said, his voice trembling with something that wasn't quite fear. "The ones who were lost. They're here." The wind howled, carrying the voices into a deafening chorus. I couldn't make out words anymore, just emotion, rage, sorrow, despair. It pressed against my skull, digging into my thoughts like claws. I stood, clutching my head, trying to drown it out. Then the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, but the shapes were too solid, too deliberate. Figures emerged from the trees, their forms indistinct but human-like. They were wrapped in darkness, their features hidden, but their presence was suffocating. One of them stepped into the clearing. It stopped just outside the circle of firelight, its head tilted as if studying us. Jeremy stepped forward, his breath fogging in the cold. "Don't," I hissed, grabbing his arm, but he shrugged me off. "I have to," he said, his voice distant. "It's what they want." The figure raised an arm, its shadowy fingers curling like smoke. Jeremy took another step forward, and then another, until he was standing just inches from it. For a moment, everything was still. The voices faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then it touched him. Jeremy screamed, a sound so raw and animalistic that it froze the blood in my veins. His body jerked violently, his head snapping back as if pulled by an invisible thread. The figure loomed over him, its form twisting and writhing like a living nightmare. "Run!" Eric shouted, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her toward the path. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground, but the sight of Jeremy's convulsing body snapped me out of it. I turned and followed them, the voices roaring in my ears. The forest was alive. Shadows moved between the trees, their shapes flickering like flames. The whispers chased us, growing louder with every step. "You can't leave. You belong here." We ran blindly, the cold cutting into our lungs like knives. Claire tripped, and Eric hauled her to her feet, his face pale with terror. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I'd see them, the shadows, the figures, Jeremy. When we finally broke through the tree line, the voices stopped. The air was still, the snow unbroken. We collapsed onto the frozen ground, gasping for breath. Jeremy didn't follow. The drive back to town was silent. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, what we'd heard. It felt too fragile, too unreal, like a dream that could shatter with the wrong word. I went back the next day, alone. I told myself it was to look for Jeremy, but deep down, I knew he was gone. The clearing was empty, the fire pit cold. There were no footprints, no signs we'd ever been there, except for the whispers. They were still there, faint and haunting, carried on the wind. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, on cold December nights, I hear them again. The voices, the pines, and Jeremy's screams. The first time I saw the light, it was nothing more than a faint flicker in the distance. The four of us, me, Matt, Lisa, and Jake, were huddled around the campfire, the December cold pressing in on us from all sides. We'd spent the better part of the day trudging through snow-covered trails in Pine Hollow, looking for the perfect campsite. By the time we found it, the sun was dipping low, and the sky was streaked with pale pinks and oranges. Matt had insisted on this trip, promising us one last hurrah before the holidays pulled us all back to our families and obligations. Pine Hollow was quiet this time of year, the kind of place locals avoided after the first heavy snowfall. They told stories, of course, campfire fodder about strange disappearances, strange sounds, and the eerie lights that sometimes appeared between the trees. But Matt loved that stuff, and he'd laughed it off when I mentioned it earlier. "Ghost stories, man," he said, slapping me on the back. "That's all it is." Now, as the firelight danced in our faces, I noticed how the shadows seemed deeper here, how the woods pressed close around us. The snow muffled everything, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the occasional hiss of melting ice. Jake was busy poking at the logs, sending up showers of sparks, while Lisa sipped from her flask, her cheeks already red from the cold and the whiskey. And that's when I saw it, a small golden light hovering in the trees beyond the campsite. At first I thought it was a trick of the fire, maybe a reflection off the ice-coated branches. But then it moved, bobbing slightly, as if carried by an unseen hand. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. "See what?" Lisa asked, turning to follow my gaze. "Out there." I pointed toward the woods. The light flickered again, faint, but unmistakable. "There, between those trees." Matt leaned forward, squinting. "It's probably just someone else camping," he said. "A lantern, maybe." "Who the hell would be camping out here in this cold?" Jake muttered, his breath fogging in the air. "Us," Matt shot back with a grin. Lisa shook her head. "It's too late for people to be wandering around, and why wouldn't they have said something when they saw us?" Nobody had a good answer for that, and the conversation died out. But the light didn't. It hovered there, distant but persistent, flickering just often enough to draw your eye. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the warmth of the fire and the low murmur of Lisa and Matt talking about some movie they'd both seen. But the light gnawed at me. Every time I glanced away, it felt like it was growing closer, brighter. It wasn't until Jake stood up that I realized I wasn't the only one watching it. "I'm gonna check it out," he said, brushing snow off his jeans. Lisa frowned. "Why? It's just a light. Probably nothing." "Probably," Jake said, smirking. "But if it's someone else camping out here, I want to know. Don't want to wake up with a stranger poking around our gear." Matt clapped him on the back. "You want backup?" "Nah, I'll be back in 5 minutes," Jake said, grabbing his flashlight. He clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, making the light in the trees seem even more unnatural. Without another word, he trudged off into the woods, the snow crunching under his boots. We watched him go, his silhouette fading quickly between the trees. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. "Shouldn't he be back by now?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. Matt shrugged, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Maybe he's just taking his time. You know how Jake is, always poking around." "Yeah, well, I don't like it," Lisa said, standing up and wrapping her coat tighter around her. He should have called out or something by now. I'll go get him, Matt said, grabbing his own flashlight. You guys stay here. If he comes back while I'm gone, yell. He didn't wait for a response. His flashlight flicked on, and he followed the same path Jake had taken, his figure swallowed by the darkness in seconds. Lisa and I sat in silence, the fire suddenly feeling too small, too fragile against the night pressing in around us. Another 10 minutes passed, then 15. Something's wrong, Lisa said, pacing now. Her breath came in quick bursts, fogging the air as she muttered to herself. This isn't normal. They wouldn't just… Stay here, I said, grabbing my own flashlight before she could argue. I'll find them. She started to protest, but I was already moving. The cold bit into my face as I stepped away from the fire, the woods closing around me like a living thing. The light was still there, flickering just ahead, always just out of reach. I followed it, my boots sinking into the snow with every step. Jake, I called. Matt, where are you? No answer. Only the faint hum of the wind threading through the trees. The light bobbed farther ahead and I quickened my pace, the cold clawing at my lungs. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted me to follow, that it was leading me somewhere. And then I saw them. Or at least I thought I did. Two shapes stood in the clearing ahead, motionless against the snow. Jake? Matt? I called, my voice cracking. The figures didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. They were just shadows, their outlines blurry and indistinct. For a moment, I thought it was some trick of the light, a mirage conjured by the cold and the dark. Then the shadows turned toward me. I froze. They had no faces, no features, just darkness where there should have been eyes, mouths. But I felt them watching me, their attention heavy and suffocating. The light flickered between them, brighter now, almost blinding. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. What the hell is this? I whispered, my breath fogging in quick bursts. The figures didn't move, but the light grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. It filled the clearing, erasing the shadows, the trees, everything. I turned and ran, the snow dragging at my feet. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of the campfire ahead. Lisa was standing by the fire, her face pale and streaked with tears. Where are they? She demanded when she saw me. Where's Matt? I couldn't answer. My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the snow, gasping for breath. The light was gone now, but its image was burned into my mind, a searing imprint I couldn't shake. We waited until dawn, huddled by the fire, too scared to move. When the first pale light of morning broke through the trees, we searched. There was no sign of Jake or Matt, no footprints, no flashlights, nothing. It was like they'd never been there at all. We left the woods that day, but I haven't left them behind. Sometimes late at night I see the light again, flickering just beyond the edge of my vision, and I hear their voices, faint and distorted, calling from somewhere I can't reach. I don't know what's out there in Pine Hollow, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it's still waiting, and it's still hungry. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. That's the part I keep coming back to, over and over, trying to convince myself it could have been different if I'd just stayed home. But I was, and what happened isn't going away, no matter how many lights I leave on or how much I tell myself it wasn't real. It was supposed to be one of those nights that stays frozen in memory. 3 friends, a roaring fire, and miles of snow-covered forest around us. Dan had talked me into it like he always did. Come on, Zach, you've been holed up in that crappy apartment for weeks. You need fresh air, you need this. I didn't. But I went anyway. Me, Dan, and Abby, his girlfriend, though you'd swear she was married to her phone more than to him. She spent most of the ride up texting, while Dan tried to keep the conversation lively. But by the time we reached the clearing he'd scouted, even she admitted it was perfect. A little bowl-shaped patch of forest with snow all around and the kind of dead quiet you don't get in town. We built a fire, dug out the camp chairs, and cracked open the cheap beers we'd picked up at the gas station. For a while, it was great. But the thing about nights like that is how fast the mood can change. One moment, you're laughing at Dan trying to tell some half-baked ghost story, and the next, the shadows seem darker, the silence heavier. That's how it felt when the fire started to die down. Abby had drifted off, bundled in her sleeping bag, and Dan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky like he was already half asleep too. The flames burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced just a little too far into the trees. "I'll grab some more wood," I said, mostly to fill the silence. Dan waved a hand without looking, and I grabbed the flashlight and headed into the woods. It wasn't far to the pile of dead branches we'd spotted earlier. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath hung in the air, the beam of the flashlight bouncing ahead of me. The cold had a way of making everything sharper, the shadows, the sounds. Every creak of a branch or snap of ice felt like it was right behind me. I was gathering an armful of sticks when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the beam hit the trees and made the shadows stretch. But then it moved. It was tall. Too tall to be anything natural. I couldn't make out details, but its shape was wrong. Humanoid, but elongated, as if someone had taken a person and stretched them out like taffy. It stood still, half hidden among the trees, but even from that distance I felt it watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods were silent now, as if every creature had vanished or fallen mute. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam darting to the ground and back up again. But when I looked, the figure was gone. I stood there for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to happen, for some logical explanation to pop into my head. A tree trunk, a shadow. That's all it was. But the unease wouldn't go away. I carried the wood back to camp, my pulse still racing. Dan was awake, poking at the embers with a stick. "Took you long enough?" he said, not looking up. "Did you hear anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He frowned. "Number Y?" "Nothing," I said, dropping the wood near the fire and crouching to arrange the sticks. "Just thought I heard something." The fire flared back to life, and I felt a little better with the warmth against my face. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing at the edge of the clearing, expecting to see the figure standing there, but the woods were empty. For a while. It started again when Dan fell asleep. Abby had barely stirred, buried under layers of blankets. I was left alone with the fire, watching the way the flames licked at the darkness. That's when I saw it, closer this time, just at the edge of the firelight. The same towering figure, motionless, its shape still obscured but undeniable. "Dan," I whispered, my voice cracking. He didn't move. "Dan," I hissed, louder this time, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and swatted at me like I was a mosquito. "What?" "Something's out there." He sat up, blinking at me. "What are you talking about?" I pointed, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "You're seeing things," he muttered, lying back down. "Probably shadows from the fire." "It's not the fire," I said, but he was already pulling his hood over his face. I sat there, staring into the woods, my heart thudding so loud I thought it might wake Abby. The figure didn't come back, but the feeling of being watched never left. I couldn't bring myself to look away, as if the moment I blinked, it would step closer. The hours crawled by. I lost track of time, my mind replaying the same thoughts in an endless loop. What if it was real? What if it wasn't? What could I do about it either way? The fire burned low again, and this time I didn't move to feed it. The shadows crept closer as the light faded, pressing in on all sides. Then I heard the crunch, slow and deliberate, footsteps in the snow. They came from behind me, circling the camp, moving closer with each step. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Dan," I whispered again, my voice barely audible. The footsteps stopped. "Dan," I said louder, shaking him harder this time. He woke with a start, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "What the hell, man?" "Do you hear it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me like I was crazy, then glanced around the clearing. "Hear what?" "The footsteps." He listened for a moment, his face going pale. Then he shook his head. "It's just the trees, wind or something." There was no wind. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up camp in silence, Abby groggy and confused as we shoved everything into our backpacks. I didn't look back as we left the clearing. It's been months since that night, but I still see the figure sometimes, in my dreams, in the dark corners of my apartment, in the shadows cast by streetlights. It's always there, waiting, just out of reach. And the worst part? I know it followed us. I don't know how I know, but I do. I hear the crunch of snow behind me, even when there's no snow. I feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, every time I step outside. Dan doesn't talk about it. He brushes me off when I bring it up, says it was just my imagination. But I can see it in his eyes. He hears it too. Whatever it was, it's not gone. And it's not done with us. I don't think I'll ever shake the feeling of that snowstorm. It wasn't just the cold, though that was bad enough. It was the way it came on so fast, like the whole world had decided it didn't want us there anymore. One minute, the four of us were joking about how soft city people like us shouldn't even be hiking in December, and the next, we were completely swallowed by white. Jake was leading the way, his GPS in hand and his trademark overconfidence radiating off him in waves. Behind him was Casey, our designated optimist, insisting everything would be fine even as the snow thickened and the temperature dropped. Emily was in front of me, quiet like always, her scarf pulled up to her nose and her hat pushed low over her ears. And then there was me, trying to keep up, trying not to think about how lost we probably were. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. Jake had read about some hidden gem trails outside of Winter Hollow, the kind you only find by word of mouth. "Unspoiled wilderness," he'd said with a grin. "We'll be the only ones out there." He wasn't wrong about that. But as the snow piled up and the trail markers disappeared, I couldn't help but think it wasn't the bragging point he'd made it out to be. By the time the sun set, it was obvious we weren't going to make it back to the trailhead. The storm was relentless, the wind whipping through the trees and carrying away any chance of hearing each other over its roar. The snow came up to our knees, and every step felt like pushing through molasses. Jake had stopped pretending he knew where we were. His GPS was useless. No signal, no help. That's when we saw it. A warm glow flickered through the trees, soft and inviting, like the promise of a fireplace after a long, cold day. None of us said anything for a moment, just stared at it. The light didn't make sense. We hadn't passed any cabins or campsites, nothing but miles of empty woods. And yet, there it was. "Do you think it's real?" Casey asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jake grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. Only one way to find out. We followed the light, tripping over roots and stumbling through drifts until the trees opened into a clearing. It was a camp, a real one, with a roaring fire in the center and tents pitched in a neat circle. A group of people sat around the fire, laughing and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. They didn't look up as we approached, but one of them, a man with a thick red beard and a wool hat, waved us over. "You're just in time," he called out, his voice warm and cheerful. "Get out of that cold and warm yourselves up." We didn't hesitate. The fire was the first real warmth we'd felt in hours, and I practically fell onto the nearest log, holding my hands out to the flames. The others followed, Jake sitting closest to the bearded man, Casey chatting with a blonde woman who handed her a cup of something steaming. Emily stayed by my side, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself smaller. She didn't say a word, just stared at the others, her eyes darting from face to face. There were 6 of them in all, each bundled in heavy coats and knit hats, their smiles wide and their voices loud. They seemed normal, I guess, like any group of campers you'd find out here. But something about them made my skin crawl. The bearded man, who introduced himself as Henry, clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Lucky you found us," he said. "Storms like this can get nasty." "Yeah," Jake replied, laughing nervously. "We were starting to think we wouldn't make it." Henry's grin widened. "We've been here for days. Plenty of room for everyone. Stay as long as you need." The others nodded, their smiles just as wide, just as warm. Too warm. Emily tugged on my sleeve, leaning close. "We should go," she whispered. "What? Why?" I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. I felt it too. Something was wrong. The fire was too bright, the air too still. And the people, their smiles didn't waver, not even for a second. It was like they were painted on. "We can't just leave," I whispered back. "We'd freeze out there." She didn't argue, but her hand tightened on my arm. I could feel her trembling, and it wasn't just from the cold. The night stretched on, the storm raging outside the clearing while the camp stayed perfectly calm. The others kept talking, laughing, passing around mugs of cider that smelled sweet and cloying. I sipped mine but didn't drink much. Something about the taste made my stomach twist. Eventually, one by one, we drifted off to the tents the group offered us. I didn't want to sleep, but my body had other plans. The moment I lay down, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke up to silence. The storm had stopped. The air was still and heavy, and the first pale light of dawn crept through the tent's thin walls. For a moment, I thought everything was fine. But then I stepped outside. The camp was gone. The fire pit was cold, a circle of blackened stones surrounded by untouched snow. The tents, the cheerful strangers, the warmth. None of it was there. Even the tracks we'd made the night before had vanished, as if we'd never been there at all. "Guys!" I shouted, panic clawing at my throat. "Jake, Casey, Emily." They stumbled out of their tents, their faces pale and confused. Jake was the first to notice. "Where the hell is everyone?" he asked, spinning in a circle like he expected them to reappear if he looked hard enough. "They're gone," Emily said softly. "They were never here." "That's ridiculous," Jake snapped. "We sat with them. We talked to them." Casey pointed to the snow. "Then where are their footprints?" None of us had an answer. We packed up in silence, too shaken to speak. The hike back to the trailhead was faster than it should have been, as if the forest wanted us gone. When we finally reached the car, I almost cried with relief. We didn't talk about it on the drive back. Not until we stopped for coffee and Jake pulled out his phone. "I took a picture last night," he said, "of the camp." He set the phone on the table and we leaned in to look. The fire was there and the tents, but the people, they weren't. Just faint impressions in the snow, like shadows that didn't belong. Emily pushed the phone away, her face pale. "I told you we shouldn't have stayed." Jake didn't argue this time. None of us did. We just sat there, staring at the phone, at the empty camp, at the proof of what we couldn't explain. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been back to Pine Hollow since, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, I dream of the camp. I see the fire, the smiling faces, the warmth that shouldn't have been there. And when I wake up, I swear I can still feel their eyes watching me, waiting.